Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Hope you guys have had a good weekend. This is episode 36, dealing with fingerprints, pubic hair, and Steve Thomas's 17 reasons for suspecting the Ramseys. In a situation where crime happens and the suspects include the people who lived in the home, you have a really difficult situation because if you find fingerprints or DNA or fibers, that's not really going to change anything because you'd expect to find all of those things in the home. The people lived there. And that would be the defense of the suspect to say, well, of course my DNA is there, I lived there. Of course my DNA is on that person lived there with me, kind of thing. And so you have somewhat of a precedent for that situation in a couple of other cases, such as the Chris Watts case, although never came up in trial. But another example is the Amanda Knox case, where you'd say, of course my fingerprints are here and there and there. I lived in the house. Why wouldn't they be there? The interesting thing in some of these cases, though, are where you would expect to find fingerprints. In other words, you don't expect them not to be there, expect them to be there. You don't. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the Ramsey case, on the ransom note, you would expect to find fingerprints, and then you don't. So we're going to be dealing with that in this episode. We're also going to be dealing with a pubic hair that was found on the blanket in the basement, the blanket that was wrapped around JonBenet's body. And then we're dealing with Steve Thomas's 17 reasons for suspecting the Ramseys. And that, I think, actually comes from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. I believe it's page 669. Before we get to that, I'm going to just respond very briefly to the ABC documentary. It's an 80-minute documentary. I'll post a link to 5 videos that of 5 parts of that documentary in the description, so you can check it out there. And then you guys can also leave your thoughts and questions and comments on this video in terms of that documentary, and also you're welcome to leave them at the post, and then I can maybe deal with that as a separate video. I'm going to respond briefly to the documentary here, and I'm probably going to do so in more depth at some point. I have left a poll on Patreon just asking them what sort of format would they prefer. So, but we'll get back to that at a later point. Before we do deal with it, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the 100 or 200 of you who've subscribed in the last day or so. And let's get started. So, a couple of questions that I had while I was watching the documentary was, first of all, are we going to see any Boulder police officers in this documentary? And I was pleasantly surprised that eventually we did see one, and quite a prominent one. Tom Haney appears, and he was a police detective. In fact, he was one of the officers who interviewed Patsy during a June 1998 interview. And it was actually to Tom Haney that Patsy Ramsey got pretty feisty and said, "Pal, you don't want to go there," kind of thing. It was also Tom Haney who questioned Patsy Ramsey about fingerprints on the bowl of pineapple that was found in the kitchen. Now we're going to deal with the pineapple, and we're going to deal with the glass that had a tea bag in it in this episode, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. We're going to just sort of deal with it in terms of fingerprints. So coming back to my criticism of and commentary, I guess, just of the ABC documentary, is when you read about some of the articles talking about it, it refers to new insights. And you would assume with new insights that you would have new people talking about it and that you would have, well, new insights. So just on the issue of Tom Haney appeared in a Dateline documentary in 2016. So Haney has appeared before in other documentaries along with virtually everyone that you see in the ABC documentary. Not everyone, but virtually everyone. A lot of the footage has been recycled and just sort of reshoveled into the thing. It's not completely old footage, but most of it feels like a regurgitation. That's certainly how I felt. But there are definitely a couple of interesting moments in the documentary which we'll get to. So this is just referring to an article in Bustle, which in turn is quoting from, I think it's Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. And essentially it congratulates Haney on kind of getting to what they call, quote unquote, the real Patsy. Okay? And as I say, this is an excerpt from Lawrence Schiller's book, and it goes, there's a quoting from that. When the case detectives viewed the tapes of the third day, they gave Haney 4 stars. He'd gotten to the real Patsy, they believed. She had exhibited the hard side of her persona, a side capable of bringing harm to her daughter. Still, it was almost impossible to believe that she'd gone from being a normal mother, which until then she had given every indication of being, to being a murderer that night. End quote. So what this is sort of getting at is that while Tom Haney seemed to have exposed the other side of Patsy, and bear in mind John Ramsey throughout just seemed this sort of mild-mannered, cool fellow, whereas Patsy showed kind of a feisty side, and that is a word that comes up in the documentary that's just come out, which I agree with. I do think that Patsy is quite a feisty character. I mean, you don't just beat stage 4 cancer without being feisty, right? What is unfortunate with the case detective's view, is that they are seeing in Patsy something else. That they're seeing in this feistiness a murderer, I guess, and that is not what I see. I just see someone who is feisty by nature, and not that much more than that. You know, a feisty person might want to go to extremes to avoid a certain result, a certain eventuality. I mean, Patsy's feistiness is also why she ended up, I mean, I think she entered, I'm not sure if it's Miss America or Miss West Virginia, probably Miss America. I think she entered it 3 times. And so that just shows you she was a determined person. I also think feistiness is a good way to characterize the Ramseys' response to being investigated. I mean, what do you guys think about that? The rest of the quote from Lawrence Schiller's book is as follows, quote, Haney had never been able to come up with a motive for the killing, and now, after 3 days of questioning, he had not been able to find a trigger that might have set Patsy off, if she was the killer, end quote. So, to some extent, they're on the right track there. Patsy has shown herself to be somewhat emotional and so on, but they still can't put it all together, and that in itself should be an indicator, a signal that maybe they're not completely on the right track. Instead, they should be looking at the motive for who wrote the ransom note. Why was the ransom note written? Concentrate on that as being the motive, okay? I do think motive is a very important question in the John Benet Ramsey case, and I think it's one of the least covered areas of the John Benet Ramsey case. And someone on Patreon made a really good comment. I think it was Patreon, where they said, once again you have another documentary saying, wow, this is the perfect family, and then this happened. There's no real discussion of the backstory. There's no real analysis of the psychology and the personality and the interactions between basically the family dynamics. You never hear about the family dynamics in these documentaries. It would be good if Tom Haney was sort of a fixture of this documentary, but he only appears at 53 minutes. So essentially, briefly, for about the 2/3 mark of the documentary, and as far as I recall, he's basically the only Boulder PD fellow that appears in the documentary. I don't think he ever does. He actually talk about Lou Smith in it? Maybe he does, but I can't remember what he said. I guess I'm going to have to go back to see what he says about Lou Smith. I did take a couple of notes, and just briefly, I was curious as to the credentials of these podcasters. So, it talks about these new people who really know the case very well, and the people saying who know the case very well are sort of family members of these podcasters. They are quite young. What is quite interesting is they are JonBenét's age. So I think they 24 years of age or so. Sorry, it's 24 plus 6, so 29, 30 years of age, I guess. And so they are... It's interesting that you're having someone of JonBenét's age from the same state talking about JonBenet, but I guess what's perhaps unfortunate about it is it's the sort of the one track which is what Lou Smith thought. In other words, the one track of the intruder theory. There are, as I said, there are virtually no cops in the documentary to give another side of the story. There's a comment made by one of the podcasters that Patsy calls 911 at 5:52 and the first officer arrives at 5:55, and the other sort of co-podcaster sort of responds, wow, that's really fast. But I don't think that is when the first officer arrived. I have it as just before 6 a.m., so, like around about 5:59. You must bear in mind that when Patsy called, she had to kind of complete the call. So, the call itself took around 1 minute. So now you are at 5:53. So it's very unlikely that the officer would, get called and be there. So the call to say, hey, you need to be at this address would take a couple of seconds as well. And then for the officer to sort of drive there, it just seems very unlikely that it would take him 1 minute or something like that. Of course, it's possible that he was was patrolling and that he was very close to the address as well. It just is quite unlikely. So my information is that the first officer, French, arrived not at 5:55. I don't know where that information comes from. As far as I'm aware, it was just before 6 o'clock. If you look at Officer French's report, he says, I responded at 05:55, meaning the way I understand it, the way I interpret it, is that is when he received the call at 05:55. And so he got to the scene before 6 a.m., which is still pretty quick, 4 minutes, if you're taking it from 05:55. There's a lot of focus in the documentary about a stun gun. This is really when you think about Lou Smith, that's something that stands out. That to me is also one of the biggest misdirections of the Ramsey case, but it's also the strongest. I'm not saying it is a strong argument, but it is seen as one of the strongest arguments for an intruder. Like, why on earth would you need a stun gun? Sorry, if there's no intruder, why on earth would you use a stun gun? And I think another way to think about it as well is your victim, your prey, is a 6-year-old girl, and so you're armed with, let's say, a flashlight which you leave behind, or perhaps a baseball bat. You're also armed with a garrote, and you've got a stun gun, and you are going to write out a ransom note, and so on and so on. Why do you need all of this for a 6-year-old, right? If you think about some of the murders of adults, some people have no weapons whatsoever. It's just physical asphyxiation. Or if you think about in the Watts case, what was the murder weapon? In the Amanda Knox case, what was the murder weapon? And in the Ramsey case, there just seems to be countless murder weapons. You know, there's duct tape, there's a knife, there's the physical murder weapon used to beat her, there's a weapon to asphyxiate her, there's the tying of knots. It just seems complete overkill. And one documentary on JonBenet Ramsey that was also Apologia was titled Overkill. I think that is a good word to describe not only the crime, the crime itself was overkill, but also the pageantry surrounding it was also overkill. The documentary also goes into the DNA myth, which is something I want to deal with in some detail. And there was an interesting quote from Dan Abrams, who was interviewed asking for his opinion, and he said, I think it was the right decision, in other words, not to take the case to trial. I'm not sure if I agree with that. What do you guys think? Then only in the last 10 minutes does the documentary actually deal with the list. So it's called The List, but it's only really the last 10 minutes where that really is addressed. I'm not going to talk about that much here. And then I think something else to just point out is that what is highlighted in the documentary is what the grand jury trial focused on. Bear in mind it ran for 13 months. And the answer is, who wrote the ransom note? That was the first part. And what is the viability of the intruder theory? So if the intruder theory is viable, then you're going to indict, I guess, an intruder. If it's not viable, then you probably need to indict somebody else for the murder of JonBenet. And so I think the bottom line is that the grand jury, that these jurors collectively didn't accept the intruder theory. And I think the other thing that's important to bear in mind is that Lou Smith presented his story to the jury, and so he had this legendary detective had the opportunity to tell his story, to sell his story, and the grand jury didn't buy it. Now, I've had people on Patreon, two of them basically saying, okay, well, there you have it. You were wrong about this based on watching the documentary. And I think I'm going to read out this comment. Someone wrote, last night here in America on the 15th of January 2020, a ABC News program aired a new documentary on the JonBenet Ramsey case. It was titled The List, Who Murdered JonBenet Ramsey. It follows the case of former Colorado Springs detective Lou Smith, retired at the time, now deceased. He was brought into the case by Boulder's DA at the time. They are still on the case looking for the intruder possible. His daughter and other detectives and volunteers are still working this cold case. And this is the part I've highlighted. It's been proven without a doubt that her parents and brother were not responsible for her death. Two of Lou Smith's granddaughters have a podcast, the Victim's Shoes podcast. Really a must-viewing experience! ! Sorry for the poor grammar. It's 2:30 in the morning. I've been up for close to 20 hours and I'm a bit exhausted. Please look this up. Most interesting. Again on 2020 on ABC. This was a brand new 2021 documentary. Cheers and Happy New Year from New Mexico, USA. But the point to emphasize, it's been proven without a doubt that her parents and brother were not responsible for her death, but not in court, certainly not to the grand jury. Then somebody else left a comment, which I think is just worth looking at. You are not going to like me saying this at all, especially since I followed you adamantly for a year. That person is 100% right and you have been wrong. God showed up a couple of days ago here in America, and now the news must tell us the truth, but only for those on the right side of history. You can't find real evidence without something called faith. I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's obviously someone else who thinks that the intruder theory is also correct. So I will be doing a thorough debunk of the intruder theory. I think this whole series has been a piece-by-piece narrative that is presenting a different theory. And this episode is going to take that narrative a little bit forward, just dealing with the fingerprints, the pubic hair, and Steve Thomas's 17 reasons. Now, in terms of the fingerprints, an article appeared in the Daily Camera on Wednesday, July 16th, 1997, written by Ali Krupski, and it refers to authorities having completed fingerprint testing on the ransom note, and wow, the results didn't positively identify the author of the document. Now, once again, you can go through fingerprints to the whole Ramsey home, and if you're finding John's fingerprints or Patsy's fingerprints or Burke's fingerprints, it's not really going to be telling you anything, because you'd expect fingerprints to be in the home. Furthermore, you'd expect their fingerprints on the ransom note, right? That is where it is odd, is that you don't have their fingerprints on the ransom note, even though they apparently, who wouldn't handle a ransom note when your child's disappeared? If you've discovered a ransom note, why wouldn't you pick it up? Why wouldn't you handle it? Why wouldn't it be almost saturated with your fingerprints? And yet it isn't. Now, I say this under correction, but I'm under the impression that only one fingerprint was found, one that belonged to I think it was a handwriting technician, a handwriting tech. And besides that, I'm not sure if they did find other definite fingerprints. Now, Steve Thomas says something quite interesting about this, and this came up during an interview with Elizabeth Vargas. Now, she's the same person who interviewed Detective Linda Arndt. I think this happened on the 10th of April 2000 on Good Morning America, and what was established during that interview was Vargas asks Thomas, were John and Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints on the ransom note? Thomas answers no. Vargas, no. Thomas, no. Vargas says, but if they found the note and picked it up, Thomas asks why their fingerprints weren't on it. Did they say whether or not they had picked it up to read it? Thomas answers, I tried to pin Patsy Ramsey down at the time of our first interview with them. Did you grab the note? Did you pick up the note? Did you clutch it in your hand and read it and run upstairs with it? Who moved it to the hardwood floor? And I couldn't get an answer to that. She didn't recall. Vargas, is it possible that the parents could have handled the note and not left their fingerprints? Or that the paper for some reason didn't retain that kind of print? Thomas, certainly, but then I think the argument can be made then when the sergeant touched the same pad, so the pad from which the note was written, he left a fingerprint on it. When the CBI examiner touched the same pad, he left a fingerprint on it. Patsy had left previous fingerprints on that pad, 5 that we identified. So that remains one of the mysteries in this case. How come there's no identifiable fingerprints on this thing if one or both parents handled and grasped it that morning? The other areas to sort of go into, besides fingerprints, there are also palm prints and footprints and unidentified hair. So in terms of the palm prints, they identified 3 palm prints on the wine cellar door. So once again, you wouldn't really need to look at fingerprints on, say, necessarily the front door handle or glasses in the kitchen or whatever. I'm not saying you wouldn't look there, but you wouldn't necessarily think anything of that if it belonged to the Ramseys. What is interesting and important are the more crime scene centered crime scene artifacts, such as the wine cellar door. What is on there? And you have the same situation in the McCann crime scene of apartment 5A. You don't really need to do too much fingerprinting other than that the window where the intruder was supposed to go in and leave. And in that respect, I just want to touch quickly on Lou Smith does a demonstration of going through the basement the basement window, and you would expect that on that jar, that shard of glass, that sharp edge of glass that is on the side of that window, you would expect clothing fibers or possibly DNA to be stripped off on those jagged edges. Does that make sense? So someone passing through, going into the home and then passing through the same way, would likely tear tiny fragments of clothing fiber on those sharp edges, that's of the glass, but also of the hard edges of the window pane, because it's basically almost like sandpapering the person that's moving through. So you would expect to find something there. Another thing you can imagine is if the intruder sort of was running around the house and put John Bonet's body in the wine cellar room, stomped around there sufficiently to leave a boot print that you could actually see the words high tech, then you would imagine some of that grit he would have stomped from the wine cellar to the window. And so as he was climbing out the window, he would have left some small granules of that grit from the wine cellar on the Samsonite suitcase and somewhere near the windowsill, and yet none of that was there. So where you would expect to find evidence, why aren't you finding that evidence? So anyway, 3 palm prints were found on the wine cellar door, 2 palm prints identified as belonging to Patsy Ramsey, and the 3rd palm print later identified as belonging to Melinda Ramsey. So you can see how family members in the house would logically leave palm prints there. I think the thing that is interesting is that Patsy's palm prints are found there, but nothing from Fleet White, who we know is there, and nothing from John, who we know is there. Then 2 footprints, 2 unidentified shoe prints were found on the wine cellar floor. We've spoken about that. And then finally an unidentified hair, a pubic hair or auxiliary hair, was found on the white blanket in the wine cellar. And apparently this pubic hair didn't belong to John Ramsey, and it didn't belong to Burke, it belonged to Patsy. And they established this based on mitochondrial DNA testing. And I don't think it's, people might jump to some funny conclusions with that. I think how that pubic hair got there was just simply because Patsy's clothing was probably thrown into the dryer with the same clothing as John Bonet. So I don't think there's anything untoward in that respect. But once again, you're finding Patsy's pubic hair, not an intruder's pubic hair. You're finding palm prints from Patsy, not from an intruder. And probably the most interesting area in terms of fingerprints is the pineapple, the bowl that had the pineapple in it. And we're going to be dealing with that in the Patreon section. So if you'd like to get that part of this episode, head on to patreon.com/TCRS. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. So although Lou Smith was very supportive of the Ramseys, he was also one of the detectives questioning the Ramseys during those marathon sessions. And one of the things he questioned them on was about the